Hello, everyone. Oh, it's great to see everybody coming in. If you want in the chat to just shout out where you are, what I like to actually do at the beginning of these things is if anyone could write not necessarily the name of where they are, but a being from where they are, an animal, an insect, a flower, and we can create a kind of digital holobiont in the chat of all assembling the different beings that are coming with us, that we may look like these flattened anthropocentric pages on our screens, but what we really are beings that are fungal and bacterial, having breathed in the pheromones and the funk of where we are. So maybe add that texture to the chat. And we can do that each time. Okay, let's see. Oh, amazing. Wonderful. I hope we can find some way of saving this chat so we can create a poem with all of these things. I don't know if that's possible. How?
Yeah, all the chats will be saved.
Okay, wonderful, because I'd love to actually make a poem with this to share with everyone.
If you remind anyone to save the chat near the end, any of us can save the chat, assuming we know how.
Great, thank you. Okay, so people are
Sorry,
still...
what's the question? I missed the question coming in.
Oh, the question is just if you want to add in the chat a being from your area, a moss, a landform, a type of stone, any being, feel free. And also you can do that throughout this whole experience. Okay, I'd ask that everyone at this point mute themselves though as we go into the session, and there will be time for question and answers after each session. So thank you so much. Okay, so welcome to Rewilding Mythology. And the first session is really about complicating the idea of storytelling as a human operation, and saying that, you know, humans arrive inside stories. We tell stories, but stories are much bigger and older than our own language and our technology. And so I'm going to start with a poem and then open it up to a conversation with my friend and magician and eco-philosopher and dancer and poet, David Abram. But I will start with this short poem. Let me find it. And if you did Myth and Mycelium, you will remember that this is a kind of reiteration of a lot of the promises we made in that course. It's called A Risky Promise. Together, we vowed to work by addition, not subtraction, honoring that bad stories and good stories can meet and intermingle and breed new microbial possibilities in the compost heap. We acknowledge that monomythologies, as wielded by empire, have acted like an antibiotic, killing off all other narratives in the cultural gut. We take this responsibility into our body, like an oyster mushroom, learning how to digest radioactivity. We thread our metabolisms together to learn how to eat toxicity. We seek a probiotic of stories to cure this narrative dysbiosis, a polyphonic meshwork of voices that refuses to reduce itself to European harmonics. We strive loudly, wetly, jointly for generative clamor. The world is a simultaneity of differences, and we enjoy the gradient that occurs when we place ourselves alongside otherness. The gradient between the summit and the valley draws the stream into being. We stream into being. We let our nuclei flow from the top of the food chain down into the pinprick mind of the tiniest nematode. We practice hyphal flexibility and narrative multiplicity when confronted with dualisms. We always pick both paths and then ask for more. When we are incorrectly confined to a fictional self, we affirm that we are a we. We split into 1,000 branching hyphae. We do not get stuck. We do not sterilize, and we do not exclude. Neither do we apologize for or resurrect bad beliefs. We mulch them with leftovers and rainwater. We add them onto the compost heap. We fuse and fork and explore and forage. We make slapdash compromises with other species. We speak grass badly. We speak tree badly. We speak ocean badly, but we do not stop asking questions. We ask, what ails the woodpecker? What ails the willow? What ails the ancestors? We have no heroes, only hydra heads. We do not need a thread through the labyrinth. We are the labyrinth. We align with the minotaur. We are ecstatic in our insolvability, our refusal to be navigated by vanquishing heroes. We honor bothness. We honor bodiness. We trust that the best collaborations are permanent and involve the co-sharing of bodies. We risk losing touch with our old stories. All hail the overlap. All hail the rot. We are ready to escape the singular. We are ready to risk new shapes. All right.
Powerful, powerful poem there.
Well, thank you, David. You are part of my compost heap. You're just hearing yourself through all of my material reiterated. I love that infinity loop that gets created when people are cross-pollinating with each other's work all the time. So, David,
Yeah.
we talked about perhaps discussing the work for which you are most well known, which is The Spell of the Sensuous, which posits that the world is enchanted and speaking to us all the time, but that our self-reflective relationship with alphabetic text and with the type of thinking that was created by the technology of ideographs has dampened our awareness of the world, and that our bodies as sensual organisms are keyed to these relationships, and we are malnourished by not being able to access that anymore. So that's like my very simplistic entry point into this conversation. What I really want to talk about is the shift between orality and alphabetic culture as being a real paradigm shift conceptually that allows for certain types of magic to happen, be they bad or good, have been very complicated for human culture. So I'm wondering if there's an entry point you'd like to begin with in that conversation.
Well, yeah, gosh, there's so much about this matter of orality and literacy. I'm currently here far from my home, which is in northern New Mexico. I'm in Cambridge, in Greater Boston, stashed at Harvard Divinity School as a visiting professor of ecology and natural philosophy, because there's this burgeoning interest bubbling all around here in animism, and lots of grad students coming here to learn more and more about animistic styles of experience, discourse, and what are these indigenous modalities of sensation, of perception, of discourse. I think, Sophie, you're very much a part of this kind of animistic renaissance. But it's so important to realize that animism goes hand in hand with a particular kind or style of culture, yes, indigenous, and as diverse and divergent as the various place-based indigenous cultures of this world are. There's this weird commonality, this sense that everything is alive, that everything has agency. But when we're speaking of indigenous cultures, place-based, we're by and large speaking of deeply oral cultures, that is, cultures that developed and thrived in the absence of any highly formalized writing system, or a writing system that was tightly coupled to their spoken language. Oral cultures, cultures of orality, seem to be far more embodied, and one is experiencing the world with one's whole animal organism, not just as a mind that is stuck inside a skull, but the body itself is this kind of magical creature that experiences or encounters the world as alive through and through, a sense that each thing has its interior animation, its pulse, its rhythm, its dynamism, its way of dancing into the present moment. Because that's the way our animal body experiences the world in the absence of intervening technologies, including that old technology of the written word. When texts are not coming between us and the animate earth, the earth itself is speaking. Everything speaks. In a deeply oral culture, yeah, there's this remarkable intimacy between language and the land, because everything is expressive. everything speaks, though most things don't speak in words, but all things have the potential for meaningful utterance. And human language, this verbal thing, is simply our part of this much wider polyphonic conversation going on between all the beings. Not just other animals, plants as well, but not just animals and plants, but also the rocks, also the winds and the weather patterns, also, the mountains and the rivers, and even dry riverbeds. Everything is expressive. Everything speaks. And so, all the languages that we now speak originated in a context of orality, in their deep origins, which is to say, our languages were born in a kind of call and response, not just with other humans, but in a kind of call and response with everything, with a speaking world. And there are so many ways to illustrate this. But anyway, let me jump and just say, writing interrupts this.
Yes.
Writing intersects and interrupts this experience of a world all alive, awake, even aware, but of a world that speaks. And different writing systems, I shouldn't, be speaking of writing as one thing, different forms of literacy, different styles of writing do this in very different ways. If we look at the more pictorially derived writing systems of China, the ideographic script there, but also, of course, the more pictographic scripts or hieroglyphics of Egypt or of the Maya, we are speaking of sign systems that include, yes, human forms and shapes derived from human implements, houses, but also they are interspersed with shapes, written characters, sort of stylistically derived from the moon, from images of other animals, felines, sunrise, a tree, rainfall and clouds, frogs. So the person reading such a text is continually reminded of language's link to a much more than human world of voices. And it's as if the written characters function as windows opening onto that more than human world that still speaks. But with phonetic writing, with an alphabet, like most of us now use, the written characters no longer function as windows. It's like you see the letter B and you go buh. You see the letter C, you go cuh. The letters refer you right back to your own face, rather than windows opening onto that wider landscape. The letters of an alphabet function like mirrors, reflecting the human form back upon itself. It's only as the alphabet spreads into a previously oral culture, usually carried by missionaries teaching the good book and wanting to teach people their ABCs so they can understand and perhaps begin to read the Christian Bible. Only then does that culture get this odd idea that language is an exclusively human power or property. Only in the after the advent and spread of the alphabet do we get this idea that language is, or meaningful speech is, an exclusively human power. And meanwhile, all the rest of the land begins to fall mute. It no longer speaks so vividly.
Thank you. I love that idea that alphabetic texts become this self-reflexive mirror, because they also, they create this solipsistic relationship, because you don't, whenever in an oral culture you're talking, you're telling a story, you're speaking into a context with air, with other people, where the whole world is liable to respond and to interrupt you and to change the entire course of events. And
Yeah.
I'm also very interested in how in oral cultures, words are never objects. They never stay still. You say permanence, and by the time you get to the start of the word has decayed. That in a certain way, oral culture honors the cycles of decay that are natural to the world. And it's always open. One breath must decay to open up space for the next syllable. And that language is always adapting, and it's always a verb. It's a verb that syntactically strings us into relationship with the bird song, with the
Yes.
weather, with the composite of people who are there, with the sociopolitical, arrangement of that particular day and time. And that it's going to be very, very particularly tailored to a map of relationships rather than one static ossified relationship between you and a page. And I wondered if you could talk about what happens when we suddenly alphabetic texts make beings that are verbs, that are streaming gerunds of matter into objects, and how this changes our thinking, how making words into objects, taking away their vibrant animated breath, allows for a certain kind of extractive anthropocentric thinking.
It sure does. Just in the most obvious, overt ways, the written words on the page have a kind of static, stuck quality. Once you're writing things down, the words and the sentences and the phrases begin to generate a kind of double of the world. They don't seem part of the flux and shift and dance of the animate shapes and forms that surround you on every hand. Rather, you come back to what you wrote down one day, and you come back the next day, and it still says the same thing. And you come back a week later or a year later, and it says the same thing. There's this weird timelessness, or a sense of language, our language, human language, as floating outside the world, the dancing world in which everything else lives and breathes. There's a sense, we start only then beginning to use words to represent the world, as if from outside, as if words were not a part of the world's presence, as if they weren't bubbling forth in the midst of the world between us and all these other beings. We start speaking about the world, about the mountain, about the weather today. How's the weather today? But we're no longer speaking so easily to the world and hearing the world speaking back to us. It's something I've been trying to bring across to some of the folks here, that even our word prayer, in its most basic Aboriginal sense, it seems to me, means simply talking to things rather than talking about things, talking to the ground, calling the sun up out of the earth every dawn. So that's a huge change. I think we have to say that this is not to say that writing is bad, or that the alphabet is the cause of all our problems, or that the alphabet is evil. I'm a writer, for heaven's sakes. I love the written word and I love to read. And what we're suggesting, what I'm suggesting, and I know, or I suspect you are as well, is not that writing is bad, but rather that writing is magic. Mm-hmm. That it is a very, very potent form of magic, or animism, we could say. That, you come down in the morning, you open up the newspaper, and you focus your eyes on these ostensibly inert or inanimate marks on the page, and straight away you hear voices, and you see visions of events happening on the far side of the world, or conversations between our president and some other head of state on another continent. This is magic. Gazing at the printed words on a page, suddenly I hear voices. This is not that different from the, Lakota woman who steps out of the village and into the forest, and her face snags on a spider web, and she, steps back, tries to catch sight of that little spinning arachnid as it's setting the struts on the web. And once she seizes it in her focus, or rather the spider seizes her eyes, she's drawn down into that other scale of experience, and suddenly, sometimes, feels herself addressed by that spider. Or a Hopi man walking outside the Pueblo and turns his attention toward a rock covered in crinkly black and red lichens and focuses his eyes on a patch of lichen, and suddenly hears the boulder addressing him, speaking to him. We just do it with our own scratches and scripts. Our oral ancestors were doing it with lichen patches, spider webs, animal tracks, cloud shapes, bent twigs, with pretty much everything. So writing, as it were, and particularly alphabetic writing, is this very concentrated form of animism. So intense, so concentrated that it effectively eclipses or hides all the other modes of participation in which we used to engage. Now it's the page that speaks. It's the words on the page speak with such potency and vitality that they kind of block out the much more subtle register in which everything else is speaking.
That's beautiful. It brings to mind, I'm very interested in the simplistic understanding of the Narcissus myth. And I was thinking that you can very easily think that writing has become a kind of Narcissus, which is we've fallen in love with our own reflection in the page, and we keep speaking to ourselves. And of course, our ideas have gotten more and more narrow and have become less and less matched to the complex, tangled, always evolving reality of our ecosystems. That we're becoming, and we're stepping out of line with evolution and resilience as we have this monologic conversation. But I was also thinking about how Narcissus is actually, if we look at the myth, because this is rewilding mythology, seeing himself reflected in the water, included in, like the apparatus of a frog's eye that looks like it's the eye of the actual pond, that sees the lilies and the scum and the insects, that's what we want to see our faces reflected in that world and participate in that relationship, and see that we are verbs strung together by, the interesting thing for me about sound is that we're instruments that produce a particular sound, and it communicates interiority without violating interiority. And so it creates an experience of a community where everyone understands that other beings have an inside and have an experience. And then when we're reading things, not everything is always flat. Everything is always available for capture rather than for response.
Yeah, gosh, that's so true. Because when we're speaking, I mean, our bodies resonate with one another. We pick up that vibe, that vibration, that rhythm. But it's not just us who pick it up. When we're speaking, a coyote loping past can feel something of what's being spoken of, because the humans are just like, they're gesticulating, but their voices are also caught in this sing-song exchange, right? But bing bong gadang, gong gawu kache dalawai bong gaday day day day. That is whenever we're speaking, where our voices are given to this rise and fall, this music or melody. We're kind of singing to one another, a lot like birds singing to each other, and a lot of the meaning in our vocal expressions is carried in that music, and is carried in that bodily resonance. So I think that's so key, and it's such a change when we slide into into writing and just writing things down, whether on pages or now on screens, other animals can't pick up anything of they don't know the alphabet. They don't know how to read this kind of thing or make sense. Maybe they can bite into my book and digest it that way. But what a big shift that is. But hey, I want to just jump back and say, I love this tweak or twist on the Narcissus myth, because there is a kind of healthy narcissus, a healthy narcissism that, just as you were saying so beautifully, sees ourselves a bit in everything we encounter. Doesn't see just me, because each thing that I encounter or gaze upon reflects me back, altered, refracted, changed, and gives me back to myself in some weirdly transformed manner. And so I love that. That seems really right to me. A kind of healthy narcissism. Yeah. And hey, as we're speaking of the magic of writing too, as a kind of intensely concentrated form of magic, let's recognize that the word spell has that weird double meaning, right? To arrange the letters in the right order to spell the name of something, but also to cast a spell upon the world. Because those two meanings were not really very different at one time. To learn to read and write with the alphabet, to learn to spell, was to cast a kind of spell also upon oneself and upon the things that one writes about. So it seems to me, only when we recognize that language or that writing itself is a potent form of magic, can we wield it responsibly. But if we don't if we think it's just a neutral tool for recording oral speech, then we kind of fall under its spell, the spell of spelling. Yeah.
I love that. And I love the moral robustness, the complexity that you bring, which is, this is magical. It's a technology that works. It does incredible work, but it casts a shadow, and we have to acknowledge the shadow and work with it. And something that I've always wanted to talk with you about is, I'm really interested about how initially the first phonetic alphabet has space for breath, that it doesn't include vowels. And then if you look at the Proto-Canaanite alphabet into Hebrew, it always includes extra contextual information, that you have to have a cultural and ecological knowledge in order to read. You always need the extra contextual information about the relationships and the animals and the breath and the place. You can't read it without place. Like, the place is always the missing vowels, the breath, the relationship needs to be infused, that in fact it needs to be spoken aloud, spoken back to the land from which it arrived. And my curiosity is how the Greeks come in and add in the vowels and create the language of conquest that can go and take languages out, uproot them from their context and write them down without any extra contextual information. And so I guess my question for you is there a mode of writing that still opens up enough space for that relationality, for that fur, that texture, that dirt?
Oh, man. That's a big question.
Yeah.
I love I love this hearkening back also to the breath that you're doing. And if I can lean in there for a moment, because this sense that, in the earliest alphabet, the Aleph Beit, the Semitic innovation from which all later alphabets derive, there are no letters, or as you're saying, Sophie, there are no written down vowels. It's just consonants on the page. Why? Well, one key reason is because the vowels are the breath sounds.
Yeah.
Every oral culture is a culture that honors the breath, the wind, the air. Why? Because for an oral culture, language, human language, is not something you can look at on a page of a book or or on the screen. It's it's what we're doing now. Language, human language is speaking, and speech is nothing other than shaped breath. Have you folks noticed this? You only speak by imbibing some of this invisible stuff around us, this elixir, this air being breathed out by all the green and growing folks. And we inhale some of this invisible stuff. And then we alchemize it within our lungs and our muscles, and we breathe it out, transformed. And as we breathe it out, we shape it with our lips and our teeth and our palate, and we let it vibrate a couple folds in our throat, and we sound it out into the world. So we only speak on the out breath. Have you all noticed that? We don't speak, by and large, on the in breath, because it doesn't sound good. It's really hard to speak when you're breathing in. We speak on the out breath, and so it's assumed that it is the breath that is carrying my words to your ears. It's the air that's carrying your words to my ears. That is the air, this invisible stuff is the very medium of meaning for an oral culture. It's the very place of the ancestors' voices. Once our ancestors have passed on, their spirits live right here in the wind, in the breath, in the air itself. They're close by. It's not like for literate civilization when we think of the invisible world as somewhere else. For oral cultures, the invisible is just like the word says. It's in the visible. It's right here. It's this unseen medium. I mean, if the air was visible, we wouldn't see anything else. But because the air is invisible, it's that through which we see all things. And so the wind, the air, the breath is like the holy of holies. It's this super sacred mystery, so uncanny for every indigenous oral culture the world over, although they all sort of display this in different ways. The earliest alphabets, the alphabets, preserved this sacredness of the wind, of the breath, of the air, by not writing down the vowels. They only wrote the consonants, but the vowels are the breath sounds, the sounds made by the unimpeded breath as it moves through the mouth. I, E, A, O, U. As breath, they were sacred. They were part of the ruach, the rushing spirit, as we say in Hebrew. And so you couldn't make a visible representation of the invisible breath. And so we didn't do it. We didn't write down the vowels. It's as if the Greeks, who sort of invented letters for the breath sounds themselves, for the vowels, effectively desacralize the invisible breath. The wind itself, the air, begins to be felt as just, oh, it's just empty space. So today we don't speak of the air between myself and the wall, or the air between me and a nearby tree. We just speak of the empty space between us. It's empty, it's a void. And so it's the perfect place to toss everything we want to avoid, all the toxic effluence of our industries, belching out of the exhaust pipes and the stacks of ships lugging tar sands crude to other continents. So the air, it's almost as if climate change is the simple consequence of forgetting the sacredness of the invisible medium in which we're immersed, of the air itself, and beginning to treat it like an open sewer.
That's an incredible observation. I've never heard you say that as succinctly, and it feels so incredibly vital right now, which is this is not empty space. You know, this is space that is alive. And I think that, you know, with the advent of the microscope, you know, we know someone in the chat brought up that fungi communicate, not with breath, but through compounds that they, sporulate into the air. And that, speech is oftentimes material, but it's also invisible. And that there's so much invisibility that's so alive and so in our every breath, that we breathe in these pheromones and these spores and this funk. And then we speak. We speak as holobionts, as mouthpieces for the air itself. That, it's hard to tell who's speaking when you're speaking with the knowledge that there's this density of matter around you, moving through you. So here's a question I have, which is, so here we are with phonetic alphabets that were created by colonizers who wanted to take other people's alphabet, other people's speech, uproot it, and then put it, I oftentimes say that, in oral cultures, they have ecologies, and written cultures, they have encyclopedias. That, in oral cultures, you actually have a smaller vocabulary, but behind each word is a real relationship. There's backing behind the gold, there's gold behind the money. But that we have encyclopedias full of words for things we've never seen, we have no responsibility to. And that seems so complicated. As part of this extractive mindset that you can hoard food, that you can hoard resources, you can hoard words. And so my question is, how can we begin to work with words and with writing and speaking in a way that is more respectful for their bumptiousness, for their aliveness, and for the fact that they come from actual contexts, actual places?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, writing in service to the more than human world. So taking care to be including these other agencies, these other agential dynamic powers, these anthills and aspen groves, including them in our writing, as you do so darn beautifully, Sophie. But bringing these other voices and powers and actors into the tale, realizing that it's not just about us, it's about all these other folks. But I think really key and a sort of magic practice is writing also for the voice. That is taking care that you're writing with attention to the sound spell of your words. So you're not, I mean, shucks, I'm here at Harvard right now, and the halls are echoing with these strange arcane languages, these jargons spoken by the weird, strange disciplines, each with their own very abstract discourse that you kind of have to withdraw from your senses and climb up into your head in order to understand what's actually being said. They're so abstract. Can we begin to write more and more for the body, for the whole body, and not just for the abstract intellect, using words that, that scratch or that tickle our nose and make us sneeze, or words that just feel good. And, the words that make you feel good will be interestingly different from those that feel good to my body, but paying real attention to the material valence and rhythm and song of our speaking. I think that's kind of key. And I also think writing for voice in the sense of don't write everything down. For us who are writers, don't write all your stories down. And so, render them in a form that can be taken far from the place where that story came, or where that story took possession of you or came to you. But let some stories just live on your tongue to be told in that place where we gather people for the telling of, how the river feels when the salmon are returning to its waters. And we tell that story in the right time of year, and we gather and we honor it, we celebrate it. So I don't think we can really replenish a kind of animistic experience of the world without rejuvenating the layer of culture that goes hand in hand with such bodacious and alive way of feeling and experiencing. And that's oral culture. Rejuvenate oral culture, replenish the culture of face-to-face and face-to-place storytelling, where we're telling stories in response to this bend in the river, or in response, or stories that live on that mountain, or it's really a story of how that mountain came to be there. That is story up the land again. There ain't no restoring the land without restoring the land.
I love that so much. And I love this idea that, you know, we've kind of fetishized the idea of the Aboriginal song lines and offloading your memory into, you know, places as being this like little, you know, indigenous practice that existed in one place and doesn't exist in other places. But it's, we can restory the land. We can, I oftentimes think that, you know, books and writing are very, very fragile ways to places to offload our information into, that, you know, they can get wet. They, you know, once we put that information down, we don't have it in our bodies and our relationships. But places are incredibly resilient. Places are incredibly resilient ways of storing and offloading our stories, our lineages, our ancestors. That if we tell a story in a place using our bodies, responding to the shapes, like connecting, stitching a certain verb into, you know, a tree at a certain place on a stone, that's a much more resilient way to store a memory, to store a story. Yeah, so I've been thinking that we can make song lines again. We can walk ourselves back into this dialogue.
I think we have to.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, for all of our ancestors, pretty much, you know, 99% of our ancestral cultures were oral, and hence you know, you couldn't remember stories just by going to the shelf and plucking a book and finding the right page. It's the land was the primary mnemonic or memory trigger for remembering so much of the ancestrally gathered knowledge of what happened here and how we can live in this place without fucking it up, and how we can learn the best way to hunt or track a particular animal, or which plants are good for healing what ailments, which ones are good for cramps, and which ones are good for blindness, and how to detoxify those plants so they're also good for food. Or all of that knowledge needs to live in stories, but the stories lived in the land.
Yeah.
It's like the land was the primary mnemonic. For us today, the book has become the primary mnemonic or memory trigger for remembering all of that knowledge. And so it's weird. It's as if knowledge floats free of place. So folks can be studying here at Harvard, learning, you know, liberal arts, or mathematics, or whatever their particular thread is. But they're learning the same things and studying the same stuff that the folks over in Stanford on the West Coast are studying, or those off in Great Britain are studying in the universities there. Because for us, knowledge floats free of place. It lives in books. But for our ancestors, and let us hope for our descendants, knowledge has begun to reroot itself powerfully back in the soil of particular places, so that each bioregion, each place is pulsing alive with intelligence that is unique to that land, unique to that realm. But hey, this links to just one last thought I want to make sure to get on the table here. Very much linked to what we've all been saying, but also that sense of that you also write of, which is the primacy of breath in the oral world. And what I was speaking of is that sense of being immersed in a meaning-filled plenum of air. I'm really just interested in what it feels like bodily to inhabit a mythic, to inhabit a world that is storied through and through.
Yeah.
What was it like for our oral ancestors? And I think, you know, one key thread is to know that the cosmos itself then is experienced as a story in which we, along with the moon sliding in and out of the clouds, or the trout leaping for a fly, we're all participant in this story. And the relation of a tale to its characters is so much like the relation of this earthly cosmos to its inhabitants. So just like there's an interiority to the perceived world, carnally enfolded as we are by, like, you know, the vault of the sky overhead, and the round expanse of the horizon. So the characters in a well-told story all live and breathe within the voluminous interiority of the story itself. So we find ourselves situated in the land with all its transmutations and cycles of change, much like protagonists are situated in a story. To a deeply oral culture, the earthly world is felt like this vast, ever unfolding story in which we, along with the other animals and the plants, are bodily enfolded. We're all characters in the story. And so it's like a world made of story is a world permeated by imagination, a world filled with dream. But it's not our dream. It's this immense dream that is moving through us and all around us. It's like that sense of the air and being immersed in this thick medium. In fact, the air and the psyche, or the soul, in an oral culture, these are not so separable. There is this sense of being immersed in a psyche, along with all the other animals and the plants, living and breathing inside a soul or an imagination that is not ours, but is rather, we could say, the earth. And we're all in it. We're bodily inside this mystery, this big story.
I mean, it's just the most beautiful thing to hear you utter that, actually, in breath, that concept about air. And I love this idea that we are not the authors. You know, I think right now, as we face climate change, there's this impulse that we will author our way out of this, but we authored our way into this, that we need to get better letting ourselves be told. And that, you know, in many oral cultures, the breath is always the Holy Spirit. It's always the divine. It's where the ancestors live. It's the thing that puts us into our ecological niche and takes us out of our anthropocentric idea that we can techno-narcissistic fix our way out of everything. Instead, we need to learn how to let ourselves be not even the main character, the protagonist, but like the side character in the woodchuck story, or in the deep time story of a place that's going through shifts that we'll never be able to see.
Yes. Yes.
Instead of monopolizing your time, which I can do some other time, I want to open us up to questions, because people have so many questions. And so if you want to, Cassandra might help me. We'll highlight you, or you can raise your hand and we'll bring you on. Yeah, I think we have time for probably 2 or 3 questions. All right, let's see. Raise your hand if you want to do it, or write in the chat. I can see if I can. Okay, yeah, so let's bring on Veer Vikram.
Hi, thanks so much for this wonderful talk, guys. So I was really loving the discussion on naming and the magic in naming, and perhaps how this is also behind some of the alienating magic of modernity. And what this made me think of also is part of what I've been thinking of is, I think some of the other magic of modernity, this alienating magic, lies in the power of transgression, right? When you treat an alive universe as dead, right? When you ignore the aliveness of the universe, in a sense, that's the ultimate transgression. And you see this same system in magical tech, where you're treating the sacred as profane and vice versa. So I was wondering what your thoughts on this, of coming into relation with this at the level of narrative interventions, right? At the level of intervention, at the level of story, like, you know, how to come into relation with modernity's alienating magic.
Well, my first thought is just simply to leave some, well, to spend a bit more time talking to things and not just about things. That is, speaking to the world, speaking to the ground, and listening for its reply is a way of loosening up your own tongue and loosening up your way with language, instead of just wielding our words to represent the world as if we were outside it, speaking as a way to call myself into the presence of the world, instead of talking about that mountain over there, calling out to the mountain, hey, great to see you today. And listening for what the mountain has to say back, or what the mountain wants to speak through me or to me. But using words as a way of calling oneself into presence, or calling the mountain or that tree or this pebble on the ground into presence with me, and seeing if it's open to the invitation and response.
I love that, David. I've oftentimes been saying to people that we need to get sillier. The answer is going to be silliness. That, when I started to really activate this in my own life, I would be like dancing for the mountain. I would be like calling out to birds. And if you look insane to another person, you're doing it right. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Let us bring on Nisa. Nissa? We'll let her character name.
Sorry, I'm gonna. Hi. Sorry, I just had to unmute myself. It's Nisa. So my question is, what would your advice be on sort of ethically, especially thinking about it in North America, I'm in Toronto, kind of ethically engaging with the indigenous populations of the land that we are on in a way that's respectful, but we're able to access the stories of the land we're on. I don't know if it's kind of like, I don't know if creolization is the right kind of word or kind of idea behind this sort of approach, but I find myself sort of struggling to access the stories of the land I'm on.
Sophie, a thought?
Well, I mean, I struggle with this because I live in a place where there was such genocide out of the Munsee Lenape people, and they are still very vibrant, but their stories that were really eradicated, and their culture was eradicated to the point where it is very, very difficult to rebuild it without doing a lot of projection. And the one thing I will say is our very bodies are syncretic. Syncretic is when two different things meld to create something new, and it can be a parasitic colonial project, it can be a symbiotic mutualistic thing, but most cultures are syncretic of other cultures. Our very cells are two bacteria that syncretically cannibalistically fused. So this is what happens, but it has to happen with a lot of consciousness. So what I always want to say is, I always want to empower people to get in dialogue with the indigenous stewards of your land. Make sure that your work directly benefits them financially, practically,
Yes.
and that
Yes.
you're not appropriating it for your own purposes. But also, the stories aren't gone just because the humans are gone. They are still there in the stones and the places, and you can still learn to access them with your body. Your body is an expert radio transmitter for the stories that are in that air, that plenum that David was talking about. So I'll want to let David speak to that.
That's so true. Because if these stories, as we're suggesting, arose between peoples and the place where they dwell, then the stories belong just as much to the terrain as to the folks who dance and work and move and carry out our lives there, and that the land holds and speaks and carries so many tales. But I think in deep answer to your question, just humility. A basic stance of humility toward the place, of course, but especially toward the peoples of place, and to the cultures that lived generation after generation after generation after generation in intimate rapport with that land, taking and working out the ways of living that allow the land to replenish and rejuvenate itself. So consulting always and listening deeply and closely to the old ways and to the peoples of the land and of place with a certain basic humility, but also apprenticing yourself, if you can, to those peoples, certainly to the place, apprenticing yourself. Again, humility. And yeah, I think there's a basic etiquette to oral culture that needs to be brought back, where any story that you are told are given, well, you ask, can I share this? Do I have the right to share of this story out in the world? Learning the etiquette of place and of culture and of oral culture seems really important.
I love that, David, the etiquette of learning to listen and to hold and to not just immediately regurgitate as your own.
Yeah.
And yeah, when you're responding to a world that can respond to you, you're going to be more careful because you're responsible. I love Donna Haraway's flip of that. You're responsible, and you're also able to respond. Yeah.
Lovely. Yeah.
Okay, I think let us bring on Tracy. Can we bring you on? I think we have time for one more question. And of course, these questions will continue to unfurl in the Discord if you want to sign up there, and I will be happy to continue to dialogue. Hello, do you want to ask your question? Just take yourself off of mute.
Hello, sorry.
Hi.
Yeah, so this question it's really about in the spirit of process and inquiry. So there may not even be an answer, and I'm ridiculous or silly to even attempt. There's something about this, going back to David, both of you talking about interiority and around writing. I so align with everything you've shared about this orality and how it gives us access to a deeper sense of relating to the wider, more than human world. And I think about the bridge that writing can be as this dense magic. And I think about being able to inhabit, that writing can inhabit something animistic. And it has to do something with our interiority, our subjective experience. And I'm sorry, I'm babbling, but there's something there. And yeah, so I'm just gonna, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I mean, that's what I mean to be, pointing toward or gesturing toward when I say that writing is magic. That it is this exquisitely potent or powerful, dangerously powerful or super concentrated form of animism that effectively, occludes or hides all of the other modes of animistic participation in which we once engaged. If we wield it responsibly, with care, I mean, it's so astonishing that novels that I've read, the characters come into me. I've not met them, but yet, Anna Karenina has partly, I've become her, she's become me, and I emerge from that novel a different person. I am deepened, transformed by Burley Coulter, who I meet through Wendell Berry's novels. He also lives through me, in me, rearranges my neurons. So I emerge from a book like that, changed, deepened, much more deeply layered. So writing, it opens this interiority, and but not just the interiority within me, but it can, if we're loving and playful in our relation to the written word, it can open a sense of the world as this immense interior that I was trying to speak of. And man, I just want to lean back into what Sophie said about silliness. It just seems to be so important to be playful. And I want to say that, you know, my research, both in the field with, you know, a tiny handful of traditional indigenous and oral cultures, but also my research into many other oral cultures has convinced me that indigenous oral peoples do not take their stories literally. I mean, they take them actually as stories about what's the real world, about what's actually going on in this world. But this world is not a literal set of static facts. It's a world that is alive, animate, shape-shifting, metamorphic, wherein each thing is crouched in readiness to become something else at any moment. That is, it's a shape-shifting world. And to speak and to weave a tale or to hear a story, a myth in a deeply oral culture is not to experience it as literally true. That's a very recent, no, in fact, let me just say this to wind this up. I've never heard anybody else write of this or speak of it, but it seems obvious to me that literal truth is an artifact of literacy. Yeah. It originally means being true to the letter of the law, which was the letter of scripture. Is that what it actually says on the page? And then we, as it were, transferred this to the whole of the terrain around us. And we ask, you know, is it literally true that rock spoke to you, David? Or that trout in the stream asked if you would please put it back to the stream? Did it literally say that to you? No, but it said it to me. It's a much deeper notion of language and of truth than literal truth. Literal truth is as recent as literacy, and it is born of the written word and the letter. The real world, the truth of the real world, is metamorphic and playful through and through. It's about being also playful in one's relation to words and how you speak. Yeah.
I love that. And yeah, someone said that it's not always magical. It's not always magical to open up this dialogue, but it certainly is playful, and it's going to have a sense of humor, you know? So yeah. Everything has a sense of humor.
And it's dangerous. Yeah. It's dangerous.
It's dangerous, yeah.
It's not just a playing world, but it's mighty darn dangerous, because there are things out and about that can eat us and ultimately will. So yeah.
And I encourage everyone to read your book, both of your books, but in Becoming Animal, I think you really, that's actually my favorite. Small the Centrist is conceptually brilliant. My favorite of your books is Becoming Animal, because it really talks about how fraught and risky these dialogues are. And you bring up stories from your own life that are just incredible. All right, David, we're so honored. Thank you so much. And hopefully there will be more discussions like this to come. I'm going to bring on Alnoor now.
Great. Thank you all. Delightful to be here, Sophie. A lovely honor to help launch this.
Thank you. Yes. No one better could have begun us. Thank you.
You bet.
All right, let's bring on Alnoor.
I want to thank David and Sophie both. Yeah, it was so beautiful to hear, and I'm still digesting the rich texture of that feast.
So, Alnoor, I'm going to read your bio, but then I'm also going to totally let you reintroduce yourself, because we just talked about how truth should be flexible and up to date and always changing. So,
no bios, no bios.
No bios? Okay, no bios. All right.
Cool. Identity is the problem.
Okay, do you want to start there? Because
uh,
we do have to speak from an identity. So how do we wield identity while also deprioritizing it?
oh, wow, that's, you know, maybe we start with the intersection of like death and identity,
Okay.
right? So in cultures worthy of the name culture, mystical traditions, indigenous cultures, etc., wisdom cultures, everything we do is preparation for death. The understanding was that death is this portal, that every moment until then is the honoring of the breath and the life. So much interaction with the conversation that we just had and that we were just privy to. Even the conception of last breath. So in that context, the moment we die is the most important moment because it is the culmination of all of our lessons. And it is the moment of the transcension of subject-object, which is the goal of many mystical traditions. And so in the Sufi tradition, in the tradition that I come from, one of the mantras is die before you die.
Yeah.
That's the aim of spiritual practice. And if the main practice is the transcension of subject-object, getting to the state where there is no you, it's also non-dualistic. It doesn't mean that you stay in that state, because of course we have to function as separate cells, you know, fractal organisms, however you want to see it. But yet it's the primary objective. So it's a practice. That's all it is, right? And we live in a culture that reifies the small s self of identity in every way, right? Passports, what do you do for a living, what your name is, right? Social locationing all the time. And it denigrates the sort of bigger S self, you know, our interactive participatory role in the cosmic congress of being and becoming. And so when it's not to say that we don't have identity, or there's this faux humility and humbleness in identity, and trying to say, let's not read bios, but it's like, let's be in the practice of not reifying our egos and our identities in a culture that already does that for us.
I like that a lot. I think it kind of also goes back to the oral culture discussion with David, which is just, you know, speech always happens as verb, as process, and it's always context sensitive. And I think that there's something about identity as being this fixed monotheism that we're always performing, that is never adapting, that is never context sensitive, and that in order to actually enter into relationships and to kind of switch into a different way of speaking, we have to leave behind another identity and enter a wholly new one. So here's an identity that you have presented yourself with, and I want you to kind of unbox it and perhaps update it orally right now, which is as a mystical anarchist. And so I'm really interested in how you pair inappropriately, like not inappropriately, but in a way that our culture would be kind of allergic to, spiritualism and activism, practical action and mysticism.
Yeah, what I like about both mysticism and anarchism is that they're non-labeled identities, and they're the same impulse, right? So mysticism, you can call it Gnosticism, is about direct relationship to the divine. In my tradition, the word Allah, God, is a metaphor for the universe becoming self-aware. So I think of Allah more as divine emergence. It's not a being up there. It is the animistic whole becoming self-aware through consciousness. And that requires direct relationship. It requires participation, co-creation, dialogue, permission, all of the things that we were, that David and you were presencing for us as a group. And anarchism is not anarchy. Right? This is the kind of bastardization of a very sophisticated political philosophy for the interests of, representative democracy and liberal capitalism. What anarchism is about is, one of its core principles is subsidiarity, that people who are most affected by the decisions that are made should make those decisions for themselves, right? That the role, not to say there should be no government or state, but the role of state should be to devolve power to the level that matters, which is people in relationship to their environment, to their ecosystem, to their biome. And one of the taglines of anarchism is no gods, no masters, which it doesn't mean that there is no rule. It just means that we collectively ratify how we want to live our lives and what our relationship to power, to the state, to our respective gods, to our ecologies should be. And mysticism is the same impulse, right? No popes, no imams, no Qurans, no Bibles, no mediation is required for us to be fully participating citizens of our time.
Yeah, it's a really powerful imperative to begin to open up that gnosis, that direct relationship, that it's going to be particularly adapted to your organism, your body, in relationship to a particular place and to an assemblage of people, and that governance has to be rooted in place in relationships. It can't be extrapolated out like this alpha. It's interesting to harken back to David, to think about how the Greeks were the first to colonize massive countries, many different ecosystems, languages, practices, and they did that with alphabetic culture. And they pretended that there was a universal mode of communication. They Hellenized everywhere. And so how do we hold globalism and the fact that we are always kind of cross-pollinating and moving over vast distances with the fact that we need to create these more subsidiary, rooted contextual ways of governing and making decisions?
For me, the starting place is where your last question ended. It's reframing the political and spiritual as non-binary. These are aspects of the same continuum.
Mm-hmm.
How we choose to live in relationship to land, to place, with our food systems, with our governance systems, these are deeply spiritual acts.
Yeah.
Cultures that advantage gnosis and prejudice spiritual practice have to be organized within a political economy that allows that to happen. Imagine a world where 9 out of 10 people were not just living to keep body and soul together, and had I'm not going to call it financial or economic, but the resource distribution and abundance to cultivate a spiritual life. We would have a creative spiritual renaissance on this planet. And part of the reason the dominant culture is so spiritually impoverished is because we've created a political economy of scarcity. We've invented this thing called debt-based money, right? That requires perpetual growth, that requires the administration of empire. And it is, to tie this back to the conversation with David, it's deeply rooted in the written word. What empire required was language to create written law, to create the accounting systems. So capitalist modernity is born out of a particular type of literacy. And it's not all language or all writing, it's the operationalization of language in service to the expansion of power and wealth and patriarchy and white supremacy. And look around us. This is the world that we live in.
You know, it's so interesting. So I've heard you speak about neoliberalism and capitalism, and I oftentimes say that myths are very alive. They're the air that we breathe, that we can't see, as David said. But unfortunately, it decides who lives and who dies. And one of those myths is neoliberalism and capitalism. Is this kind of very particular type of colonial take on the alphabetic abstraction made possible by writing. And so I was wondering if you could actually lay out for us what neoliberalism is, what capitalism is, and how we can begin to see the invisible web within which we're stuck.
Yeah, I'll try to do that. It's a big task.
Yeah, well, you do. I will say that you have a book that's out that talks about this. So I just want to draw attention for that. So this is just the beginning, the portal, the doorway into your more deeper dives with that.
Yeah, thank you. So really, this is a conversation about context. And what you said really struck me around the vowels and consonants. And the role of vowels was the pause, the breath, for context to be understood. And it's a very powerful metaphor for neoliberalism as well. What's happened is we've created a culture where there is no space for breath. There's no space for even the belief that there could be an alternative to our current system. You know, the famous Frederick Jameson quote, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And so the collective imaginary has been completely shaped and limited by neoliberal capitalism. And so people will say, well, I'm not a political person and I'm not interested in politics or economics. But what I'm trying to say, and many are saying the same thing, is that neoliberalism is not something outside of us. It is the oxygen that we breathe. Every aspect of our lives are mediated by capital. Where we grew up, who our neighbors are, what we do for our leisure time, what we do for our work time, what our social relations are, what our relation to the ecology is. There's no aspect of our life that's not mediated by money, right? We used to have cultures that had many ways of acquiring goods and services: gifting, bartering, fishing, hunting, gathering. We were embedded in gift economies, in economies of deep reciprocity, of a kind of a covenant of reciprocal sustenance. And then through the invention of debt-based capital in the 1500s, late 1400s, early 1500s by the Medicis, and then the expansion of that through European empire, imperialism, colonialism, etc., Western European nation states went all around the world and imposed debt-based capital. And so now indigenous people cannot even fish or hunt in their own ecologies without permits and all of that. And so now there's one way to acquire goods and services, which is fiat debt-based currency. And so we think that we can achieve some forms of spiritual enlightenment outside of understanding the context. But this is the collective context we're in. And neoliberalism even mediates our spiritual lives. Who has access to yoga? Who has access to Ayurveda? Who has access to indigenous traditions? Who has access to ayahuasca? All of that. And the context in which we're embedded now, this context that we can call capitalist modernity, and I like this framing of capitalist modernity. It's a term from Abdullah Öcalan, one of the fathers of the Kurdish resistance movement, and one of the leaders of Rojava, who's in solitary confinement in prison, in a Turkish prison, has written a beautiful series of books called Manifesto for Democratic Civilization that I highly recommend reading. But what's core about it is it's not just capitalism as a political economy, and it's not just modernity as a socio-cultural phenomena, but it's the merging of the two. And so what's happened is from this last 500 years, this sort of blip of time, we've merged capitalism with imperialism, with a very particular type of debt-based, growth-based political economy, with a very particular type of nation state run by representative democracy, merged in the patriarchy that was born from the Neolithic Revolution, merged Christian binary dualistic thought, merged Enlightenment, separation, rationalism, materialism, positivism. And then we have this sort of, and then of course, white supremacy and the Western European project of hierarchalization and domination into this sort of perfect stew of fuckery. And this is the context that is mediating all aspects of our lives. And so one of the things I say is that the first step of this is to really be good students of our culture. Like if we spent half the time we spend on self-help and development, and we did in just understanding the context in which we are enmeshed, there would already be a revolution. But we somehow have created these binaries and this dualistic thinking that the political economy is outside of me. Neoliberalism, which is just the latest chapter of capitalist modernity, it's the chapter of the story we're now in, is the dominant mythology. And so when we are crafting, recalibrating, remembering new, ancient, emerging stories and myths, we also have to understand the mythological environment, the mimetic landscape in which we are offering these stories into.
Thanks. And I think I want, because I feel like you're a person who really matches the theoretical with the practical. How can we begin to practically become good students of our culture? What does that look like?
Yeah, this is also like lifelong practice. So I think the starting place for me is really ontology. That's what the more I research into this work and study mystical practices and study political praxis and different modes of critical thinking, what it comes back to is ontology. And I know and trust, and you're going to speak a lot about ontology in this course, but onto comes from the Latin word for vision. Ontology is just a fancy philosophical word for saying our theory of being, our theory of understanding reality, the isness of the world. And so if the dominant ontology is a separatist, materialist, rationalist ontology, and I'll say what I mean by that. We are separate from the natural world. You could call this dualism. That was the original dualism of enlightenment. And then that dualism then extended to women, to indigenous people. We split nature and mind, and even in our own bodies, especially in our own bodies, the mind being the rational godlike part of us, and the body being this lower animalistic aspect of us. So this original division of dualism and separation exists in the very way in which we see the world, because we are entrained, socialized, acculturated, colonized by this worldview. It's in every textbook we've ever read. It's in the discourse of every news channel we see. It is the dominant language. It is the oxygen by which we breathe. And it then influences the very way we see the world. And then the materialist aspect of it is that we can reduce the entire world to its material constitutive parts. The entire world can be reduced to the atom to the electron, the proton, the neutron, and now with quantum physics, the quarks and the protons and what have you. But we will then find the grand unified theory of everything. This is the hubristic arrogance of the scientific materialist project. And what that reductionism does is, it may be true on one level. I don't deny science. I believe in the scientific method, but I also see science as the floor of understanding, not the ceiling of understanding. It's one way to interpret the world. And what I'm gesturing towards is a transrational approach, where rationality has its place alongside intuition, the whispering and murmurs of ancestors, the wisdom of place, the dialogue with the animate cosmos and the Gaian entelechy. That these things are in conversation, in a process of co-emergent becoming. And so when we focus on the materialist reductionist worldview, we cast our gaze as such on the world. And then we marry the last part of this, which is the rationalist aspect, which is then this separate materialist world can be reduced to and understood and comprehended by the human mind. That we somehow feel that that is the natural order of things, that we are entitled to understand and subject the world to our certainty and our knowing. And the combination of these three things, the combination of dualism, separatism, of materialism and rationalism, has shaped the ontology of the Western mind, of the Occidental worldview. And we're all conditioned in it. Unless you have not been affected by globalization and capitalist modernity in some way, we have been shaped by it, right? So my computer is sitting on this wood desk that's sitting on my lap, and I see it as a separate piece of inanimate matter that I feel entitled to move and manipulate in whatever way suits my whims. As opposed to, let's say, a different ontology, which is that this piece of wood is kin that I'm in relationship with, that it has sacrificed its being to have this intimacy with me now. And then my way and my manner of approaching this being is fundamentally different. And so what activism and political action and the materialist approach, Marxism, historical dialectism, what these things would say to us is that we need to change the structure of power. And where I'm moving to is, you can change the structure of power, but if we don't change the consciousness by which we are gazing our relationality to the world, then we will just replicate the same structures over and over. That ontology is the starting place. And ontology is not a switch. We can't just go from, positivism, rationalism, materialism to animism and relationality and quantum queerness with a switch. It requires a constant vigilance. It requires a practice. It requires also shifting the very fabric of space-time and the materiality of our world and the people around us and their worldviews and their ontologies, because we're entangled with all of that. And so, and I don't know if I've answered your question directly, but that's, to be a good student of our culture, we have to know the ontological gaze in which we are currently trapped and enmeshed, and then actively practice a kind of animistic memetics, a kind of liberation ontology, if you will, to find ourselves back to what our deep time ancestors understood inherently.
I love that invitation to, well, first of all, there are a bunch of different aspects of what you just said, many that we could dive down. One is that there's an approach, that the approach is the most important part. It's not, I'll summon our mutual friend Bayo Kamalafe says the way we do the solution is part of the problem. We're approaching the problem with the same tools that we made the problem with. So we have to go right back to the ontological ground. And something I've been thinking about a lot is that science, even though it has been, used as the tool of material reductionist extractive policies, also provides a portal into the umwelts, the sensory world of beings who might have better ideas about how to actually be, not how to make meaning, but how to be. I sometimes think that we talk about like the meaning crisis. It's a being crisis. We need to practice a kind of kaleidoscopic ontology. We need to think about what does being feel like to a dragonfly, to a fungi, to an ecosystem over the span of 1 billion years. And I know that you've used the Kali Yuga as a way of widening the frame, that we have such a narrow slice of perspective when it comes to how being happens, how meaning is produced. And I was wondering if you could draw us into the wider landscape of the Kali Yuga.
I love the language of kaleidoscopic ontology. And maybe I'll say one thing about ontology before we move to Kali Yuga and sort of bridge the two by saying that the aim of and let's say desire to cultivate a liberation ontology is not for necessarily an end state in and of itself, but that the superpositions of possibility shift with the gaze of ontology. As you know, Karen Barad would say that the universe meets us halfway. That these, as our gaze shifts and our fields of relationality shift, then new fields of coherence are created, and then these emergent pathways open as we are in dialogue with the more than human realm, and the more than we can understand realms, and that humility is the currency of this dialogue, and that the desire for certainty and this hubristic anthropocentric approach is part of the limiting cognitive landscape that we're it's not even trying to transcend, but we're being sensitive to and aware of in order to deepen our practice into something else. And we don't know. I'm not even claiming that I have a point of view on what that something else is. Right? I'm not offering solutionism or hopium or any of that. But it's part of it is like we don't know what we will become if and when we practice other ways of knowing, being, and sensing in and with the world. But whatever we're doing now is not working. Like we think that we are at the peak of progress. Human beings are the pinnacle of evolution, and we're simply the youngest species, and our record shows that we are the most disastrous and calamitous of all species. You know, we've taken that mantle even from the dinosaurs. And that this sort of period of the Anthropocene, what it's asking of us is something we don't know the answer to, right? So the civilizational project of the 1600s, the 1700s of the Enlightenment, for them was very clear, right? If we just rationally understand the world and we conscript it and we transcribe it and we dissect it into categories that we can understand, we will find meaning in the world. And that project failed. But that project also had its benefits in some ways. The Enlightenment moved us away from different types of Christian fundamentalism, for example, and of course created new types of Christian fundamentalism. And so that's kind of where we're at. And one way to describe the current context is the Anthropocene, and another is the Kali Yuga. And I like this frame of the Kali Yuga, and it also has its limitations and problematics. So many people are familiar with the Vedic scripts and the sort of pre-Hindu, pre-Buddhist mythology that was sort of born out of these scripts. And one of the central premises of early Vedic thought was that history is cyclical, that it happens in this great yuga cycle. And this great yuga cycle is made up of these 4 sub-yugas. And these lesser yugas, the first one is the Satya Yuga, is the golden age. And it's the longest of the yugas. So in one of the ways to understand this, there's a 26,000 year great yuga cycle, which is a huge mythological cycle. It's the precession of the sun. That's how big the storytelling is. And this is 5,000 years ago. Right? This is some of the first written texts. And so of this 26,000 year cycle, the Satya Yuga, the golden age, is 12,000 years. It's a very different cosmology, right, than evolution, that we move to this peak of something. It's that we start in the peak. We start in the golden age. And through loss of memory, through amnesia and anesthesia, we degrade into the Silver Age, which is the second longest, which is 8,000 years. And then we degrade into the Bronze Age, and then we degrade into the Kali Yuga, which is the current period we're in. And some people say it started at the death of Christ, so we're coming to the end of that period. There's a lot of debate amongst the astrologers and Vedic priests and all of that. And I'm not even saying any of this is right or wrong. I'm just saying this is an interesting frame to think about the Anthropocene in. And when we look at other traditions, the Buddhists call this the age of degeneration. The Hopi prophecies, this is the time of the sixth sun. The Iroquois prophecies, this is the time of the seventh fire. And that we are in this period where human ignorance and hubris has led to essentially a fork in the road, where we have to decide if we are going to return to living in symbiosis with the living world or continue our project of domination. And when we think of this in terms of the yuga cycles, what's of course is interesting is what comes after the Kali Yuga is again the Satya Yuga. There's no gradual, you don't go backwards from bronze to silver back to the Satya Yuga. There's a moment of great intensity. A birth canal is open between the Kali Yuga and the Satya Yuga. And this is the period we're in. We're in that birth canal. And it's not guaranteed that the cycles will continue either. There is no guarantee of the next Satya Yuga. And one of the aspects of the mythology I really like is the idea of Kalki. Are you familiar with Kalkis?
No.
So in the Hindu triumvirate, there's the 3 primary beings, which is Brahma, first breath, Shiva, Shakti, creation, destruction, and then Vishnu, the sustainer god. Kalki is the 10th and final incarnation of Vishnu. And he rides up on a white horse with a light sword, and he chops the heads off all the capitalists. This is my interpretation. Anyone who benefited from the Kali Yuga. He's the harbinger, he's the cleanser. And that in some ways, as we sort of enter this, the most tumultuous period of late stage capitalism, where we've crossed the 6 of the 9 planetary bounds, 200 species a day are going extinct. The logic of fracking and extraction to the last drop will try to cut down the last tree and take the last piece of cobalt and the last piece of lithium. And, as this is happening, that some form of intervention will happen. And I don't see Kalki as like a savior, as a messianic figure. I see it as a collective shift in consciousness, that we ourselves decide what mythology we will write and the manner by which we will approach the next yuga, if it is to come. And that will be a collective decision on some level.
That's an extremely helpful frame. I've also heard that you, in other moments when you've spoken about this, and I also want to leave time for questions, but you've talked about it as, well, I think about in biology that moments of extraordinary environmental pressure often actually inspire creatures to create symbiotic collaborations they never would otherwise risk. That, you know, it's moments when plants make it onto dry land and don't have root systems and are struggling to access nutrients that they let fungi into their own bodies and that act as surrogate root systems. And I know that you've talked about the Kali Yuga as also being a time that inspires help from other places, that the animate world is actually more helpful at this moment and more accessible. And I was wondering if maybe before we draw in questions, you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I love the analogy between, and I think you've said this before, is that there was a moment where we transitioned from primarily waterborne life, bacteria, etc., to land-based life, and that threshold, that transition period, required all types of strange, unlikely queer alliances and merging of bodily functions and ecosystems, and it's very similar. And on a sort of esoteric level, what is said is that the Kali Yuga, although it's the most difficult time to incarnate, the souls who choose to incarnate in that time are the souls that are the most ready for that task. So that's one of the upsides. The second is it's the time where karma is burnt up the quickest. So there's deep spiritual benefit of being here right now. The healing of our lineages and our ancestors and past lives, and that can happen at a rate that could not happen if the stakes were lower, let's say. And on a physical level, that risk exists. You know, we may be the last human beings, or our children may be the last human beings. That is a very real possibility at the, you know, at this juncture in the sixth great mass extinction and in the Anthropocene. And then the third is that this is the time where we get the most support from interdimensional beings, gods, archangels, however you want to see it, the sort of spiritual esoteric realms. You know, this is what is part of the esoteric lure of the Kali Yuga in the Vedas. And I say this, and I'm not even saying any of this is true, right? And I don't believe in truth in an objective sense. And David spoke to that as well. David has a line, I think from The Spell of the Sensuous, where he says, "There is no such thing as objective truth. There's only the quality of relationships."
Yeah.
So I'm just in relation to this story of the Yugas and to the Vedas in one way. This is not scripture to me. This is not more holy than any other myth, which is also holy, right? Because I'm trying to create a worldview of multiple simultaneous ontologies.
I love that. And I think a lot about the Zapatista call for a world within which many worlds fit. That, you know, and that's really, I think, the thematic pulse of this course, which is just, you know, ecosystems are more resilient insofar as they have more species and more connectivity, more myths interpenetrating, connecting with more myths, no monomyths, no mono narratives. I mean, I could talk with you about this all day, and I find it to be very, you know, it's easy to feel paralyzed by this moment and to feel that we've been brought to the brink. And I think that the context of the Kali Yuga does, it feels like you've been called. You know, there is a readiness, there is a potential for extraordinary collaboration. So I feel very comforted by that framing. I do want to open it up to questions. So if people want to come on right now, let's bring on Sol.
Hi, this was a great talk. Thank you, Alnoor. But I disagree with you in some parts. I feel like the narrative that we see, the otherization of the late stage capitalism is not, I think it's just an effect of how humans are able to coordinate in large numbers. But I don't think it's necessary to be fighting it. Like so this comment comes because there are some children who are born with a special type of autism in which they cannot read faces. So you have a child, and then when a family receives a child with such gift, the family has to learn how to to learn to live with somebody who cannot read emotions in their faces. And it seems to me like we humans are unable to read faces through our the more than humans. So we are the ones who are wreaking havoc and using living beings as objects. And so I think this reorganization that is happening all around us. The nature is learning to live with us. And of course, we're making a mess. We're taking living beings and we're turning them into death. And we're turning them into plastic. And so, but I think I think the power that we have with the world is to help each other out to recover the embodiment of how to think with the whole body, how to think not just with the rational mind, but to allow us to learn to start seeing the reaction of our effects on others. So I don't know if English is my second language, so I don't know if this is communicating well, but so I think humans have the extreme ability to coordinate this superorganism, and we are coordinated in a very powerful, because this is what we do. But I think the key here is to allow us to write stories so that we can give other people the power to see that everybody thinks and everybody feels, and through animism or through whichever ways. I feel like coming from an anti-capitalist point of view, I feel like it's sucking the air out of the room to be thinking so much about this thing that was made by humans. So this is a thing that happens. Either like we like to self-coordinate, and that's it. I'm not gonna suck the whole air out of this conversation, but that's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure I fully understand the where we disagree, but I'm gonna try to sort of bridge that. So here's the thing that our fear of dualism creates duality. Our inability to acknowledge the moment that we're in and think that we can bypass capitalism, or that it sucks oxygen out of the air or whatever, this is part of our response mechanism. And there's no aspect of our lives that is not mediated by neoliberalism. Our ability to coordinate, what does that even mean outside of neoliberalism? We have no idea. Name me a kind of an avenue, and I'll show you how it's a subsector of capitalism. We think that technology is going to somehow create means of coordination. Well, who decides what technology is being invested in? The research and development, who are the type of people who go to the universities that go and do the research and work in these things? Okay, same cryptocurrency, blockchain, these are all subsets of capitalism. The very means by which we coordinate, the very means by which we communicate, the very means by which we spend our time are all mediated by capital. So I'm not saying all we need to do is focus on capitalism, but what I am saying is, if we do not understand the oxygen which we are breathing, then our responses will not be commensurate to this moment in time. A line that came to me, and I attributed it to psilocybin. So what the mushroom said to me is another way to say this, is that if you do not have a critique of capitalist modernity, you are contextually irrelevant. But if all you have is a critique, you are spiritually and culturally impoverished. So what I'm putting forward is a non-dualistic approach to understand the times that we're in and how it's mediating and affecting every aspect of our lives, to not bypass that, to not bypass the colonialism and imperialism and genocide and patriarchy and white supremacy that have distorted and mediated most people's lives and the entire ecology's beingness, and not to stay there, because critique is not going to create new mythopoetic, let's say new ancient emerging mythopoetic landscapes of possibility. And both are true simultaneously.
I want
then-
that written down.
Sorry?
No, I just say I want that written down. It's a brilliant way of just encapsulating what's required of us right now. Yeah.
And then I also just want to address something that someone put on the chat box around the Kali Yuga, which is, again, Kali Yuga was a mythology that was used in a certain way. And it has, and this is why I say it also has its own problematics, that it has been bastardized by Hindu nationalism and fascism and the Brahminic caste system. But it's not that the cycles themselves and the story of the cycles were themselves fatalistic. Just like any mythology and any story, that they are products of their context. And the context we're in is the context of imperialism, of hierarchy, of separation from the natural world. And then that then gets usurped and retold. Like, we don't know what the original Vedas were, and we can't, because they were just products of their context. That's why I say I don't hold them as holy scripts in that way. I also don't hold the Quran as a holy script in that way, even though I come from an Islamic tradition. And just like I don't hold Muhammad or Buddha in that way, because they were products of their context. And the translation of what they said and what they did, we have no recollection of, unless it comes from direct experience. And I believe we can tap into those fields of experience. And so I don't say what I'm saying as quote unquote truth. What I would say is, if the ideas of Kali Yuga resonate with you, or just like if the ideas of Buddha resonate with you, is to tap into those fields of understanding, those fields of coherence yourself, and do your own Gnostic, cognitive, spiritual political praxis. And that even these stories, that has been sort of present and mentioned here a lot, they're not outside of place. Like, what would Buddha be without the Bodhi tree and the ecology that held that space, right? What would Muhammad be without Mount Hira and the Arab desert landscape that held him? They were products of their context in relationship to landscapes and geographies and cultural contexts that shaped and formed them.
I love the toilets.
Someone just jumped on. Yeah, this is kind of the root system of this entire course, which is just, once you uproot a myth, a story, a way of being from its web of relationships, it can easily lapse into dogma. It stops making sense. And so you have to understand that it's the product of a time, a space, and a composite of many different beings. And you can update it, and you can pass it through your breath and your organisms back into your web of relations in a way that makes it relevant again. But it's going to be inherently changed through the translation of your body and the time period. I'd love to I also want to say one last thing, which is I really enjoyed that the first myth we're talking about is not, some precious idea of like, I mean, I write about Dionysus and Greek myths a lot, but we're talking about the myths that are actually deciding who's living and dying right now, which is capitalism. You have to acknowledge that it makes decisions and it is a myth. So I really am glad that that's where we've begun. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Do you want to come on, Clara and Ken?
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much. So I have a question that was seeded during David's talk with you and has just grown. So I'm really glad that I can ask it now. So I was thinking critically about your invitation to view the narcissist myth in a sort of different way. And what it got me thinking about was, I guess, the transition from a sort of like mystical way of interacting with the natural world. Like in my culture, in Mexican culture, we have stories of people observing the surface of a lake to determine whether or not a certain water spirit was there and what its will was for that community. Or even in the biblical myth of this burning bush communicating some information to monarchy where you have no longer someone who is really interpreting the divine through the natural world necessarily, but someone who's literally claiming to be the divine and is bringing on this attire to make themselves look as much like God as possible, to wield control over other people. So as storytellers, as people who are studying ontology, what I'm wondering is what care we have to take, both in the telling of our stories and in the reception of other people's stories, to ensure that the sacred, that the nonverbal that we are hoping to tune into is really being perceived, to make sure that we're not projecting our own voice and our own image onto the natural world around us. And I wondered if you could talk about maybe some of the critical thought around anthropomorphizing the natural world and projecting humanness onto the natural world around us to support our own selfish, human-centric narratives and agendas.
Thank you so much. I really want to start with anthropocentrism, because this is something I was talking about with queer mycologist Patty Cashian, who's a friend of mine, and we're local. And we were talking about how the imperative against anthropocentrism is actually a tool of material reductionists to not consider the aliveness. And that if you actually look at many other cultures, anthropocentrism is a way of creating care and understanding that the world is alive. It's a way of weaving things into your story. And so that anthropomorphizing other beings is problematic and is something that can, here's the thing, I think it goes back to Alnoor talking about the approach, that when we approach landscapes, and David, it goes back to David too, they're able to respond to us. We should be able to update our thinking, to be surprised and to be open to constantly be shifting our understanding. And I think that anthropomorphizing beings actually can be a way of creating care. So I always want to complicate that a little bit. I do think that the answer to your question is that there's going to be time that, we're so addicted to a simple heuristics, to you do these 5 things and you learn how to listen to your landscape and then you know best. And the truth is that developing the muscle of this intuition, of this listening, takes years. It takes devotion. And I think personally, and this is what I'll offer for today, it takes courtship. That, we have not been courting the land. We have not been bringing it gifts. It's not going to communicate immediately. We've treated it badly. So we're going to have to begin to think of it as like a lover that's been scorned. How do we begin to convince it to talk to us? I'll give it to Alnoor.
Yeah, and I also, if David is still on, maybe it would be great to hear David's perspective as well to kind of close the loop. And the only thing I would say is that language itself is inherently anthropocentric, right? Our subjective gaze is inherently anthropocentric. And I don't know if there's any pure state of non-anthropocentrism. But there are ways to cultivate subjectivities that are less damaging, that are less commodifying, that are less transactional, and that alone is worthy of striving to. Yeah.
Thank you for that very, very, very good question. Because David's still here, and because I like breaking rules, let's bring David on, and maybe we'll just end with David and Alnoor, and maybe you guys can speak to each other for the last 2 minutes, if that's all right.
Hey, Alnoor, that was powerful, man. Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly.
I can hear you.
Yeah. Not much.
Maybe we can say a prayer. Would each of you like to offer some kind of prayer or utterance or glossolalia? Like maybe we should just kind of, really amp up the speaking in tongues aspect of this. So yeah, maybe we can end with a prayer.
Well, I just want to say, in relation to the last question, which was a lovely question. Sometimes it does seem to me that anthropomorphism is the converse of anthropocentrism. It's a way into relationship. As long as we realize that, you know, the trout is troutomorphizing me, and
Yeah.
the spider is spidermorphizing its world. What I like in the term is the morphe, the shape, the body, that we see the world from a very limited perspective of this two-legged, two-armed, creaturely form. And anytime that I'm anthropomorphizing another being, I'm also, you know, if I'm anthropomorphizing a tree, I'm also phytomorphizing myself. I'm being seen through all these other perspectives and angles all the time. And so just important to realize that. And that is kind of a prayer.
It is. The world is pushing back, that if we have agency, the world has lots of agency. Alnoor, would you like to say something to close?
Yeah, maybe I'll introduce a Sufi mantra, and it's a zikr, and it's La ilaha illallah, which many people would have heard in other contexts, which literally just means there is no God but God. In the Sufi interpretation is there is no energy except divine energy equally distributed among consciousness. So evolution is not a thing that happens outside of us, that we are co-creating the emergence of God itself. Right? God is becoming self-aware through us. And through, not in an anthropocentric way, but through all consciousness. And all beingness is consciousness. What is the opposite of animism? It makes no sense. How can something be inanimate within a deity in a being that is animate? The Gaia Enteleki is herself a being embedded in a deeper being of the galaxy, the expanding universe, etc., etc. And so maybe the prayer is that it's called the confession of unity, La ilaha illallah. And you'll see old Sufi masters just walking around and claiming La ilaha illallah to everything they see. Plants, trees, cement, exhaust fumes from a pipe. It's just La ilaha illallah. And that's my prayer for us, is that as we deepen our confession of unity, that we also learn about ourselves and our place in the wider cosmos in a way that does not require the validation of our identities, but the opening of what could be, and in service to the emergence of Gaia's will.
Well, this feels like a pretty spectacular beginning to this. Thank you guys so much for bringing your full, enlivened, wild selves. Yeah, everybody, thank you so much for gathering. This will be recorded and uploaded. And I'd ask Alnoor and David if you would send along resources, articles, essays, or the books that you recommended so we could send them along. And I will see you next week. I love you guys all so much. Be well. Thank you.
David.
Bye.
Hey.